Ekko, the boy's savior. But even more importantly, the boy who gave up heaven to save everyone. In my Season 1 analysis of ARCANE, I never found Ekko to be that interesting. And now, upon watching, especially rewatching Season 2, I realized I was wrong for not giving him his own section. Ekko, fundamentally, is the opposite of his childhood crush, Jinx. While the latter wishes to burn it all down for the sake of itself, because of the trauma she has experienced, Ekko instead wants to build something. A special community that can outlast Son. This is why the Firelights ruin the plans of Silco. For their own safety, so they don't become associated with Zon and are destroyed by Piltover's hand. This is especially highlighted from the fact that Ekko himself wants to deliver the gemstone near the end of Season 1, to showcase that he and the rest of the Firelights are not Piltover's enemy. Now, it's important to note that neither Jinx's nor Ekko's approach is fundamentally wrong. Rather, they are both just trauma responses to the society they grew up in, and the society up above that endlessly oppressed them. ARCANE goes out of its way to show that Jinx is not innately evil in her response and ethos. And while I certainly agree with Ekko's plan much more, I realize that my agreement comes from a place of relative privilege. I come from the US, the world's foremost superpower, and I'm a white straight dude. And while I believe the government oppresses us all in some way, I'm not that detached from reality to not realize that many people have it much, much harder. And I myself have showcased in these videos that the characters of ARCANE do these actions, whether good or bad, out of love. And sometimes people simply don't know what else to do except burn it all down. Again, I'm not advocating for anyone to do this, rather I'm saying that I understand it. Jinx's situation in so many ways is similar to the Black Lives Matter movement riots, and that they both have been demonized as inherently evil by people that, quite frankly, I just don't feel fully understand human psychology. And yes, now I'm doing that thing where I talk about politics, so please enjoy. And no, this entire video won't be about this, but I feel as if this is both very important to talk about in the context of the real world, but also ARCANE's. And that this distinction between Jinx and Ekko is vitally important to understanding the story. Look, man, I'm not saying riots should be a thing. While I'm not that sympathetic towards stories that are megacorporations being robbed, I mean, I have a personal vendetta against Target after all. I do understand that, take the riots of 2016 for example, in many ways, these people were destroying their own homes. Specifically local stores and shops that had black owners. I don't think anyone would claim that this is a good thing, even though I feel as if that's the conservative Trojan horse of just claiming black people are inherently more violent, but I digress from that racist bullshit. But what I am saying is that, well, these people, often oppressed young black citizens, just don't know what else to do aside from burn down the establishment that has quite literally been killing their own people for decades. Now, dear God, this isn't to say these people are stupid or anything, but you, dear viewer, what would you do when peaceful protest won't work? When it seems your very government that is meant to protect you is out there actively killing your family and friends, your people? What the fuck do you do? Honestly, ask yourself that. I think the best example of this is the killing of George Floyd. Now, before I had people in my comments saying, well, there were drugs in his system, that's what killed him, sit down and let's have a chat. Perhaps drugs did kill him when paired with the stress on his body from Derek Chauvin. But let's focus on that latter pig for a second. 9 minutes. He kept his knee on the throat of George Floyd for 9 minutes. And I ask you, what purpose was that for other than Chauvin's racist, preconceived out notions of Floyd? There is simply no excuse for that, and yet conservatives want to focus on the drug thing. And I'm not saying George Floyd had drugs in his system. I have no fucking clue if drugs ultimately killed him, but why are they so focused on that? Because they need an excuse. Plain and simple. Because they can't accept that an officer of the law would at bare minimum try to abuse and kill a man based solely on his skin color. Because conservative leadership wants you to think that America isn't racist anymore when it so clearly is. Because ultimately, America still wants to feed you this lie that anyone can make it in this country through hard work and grit, even though Death of a Salesman debunked that decades ago. Neo-Nazis want to feed you that lie that black people are genetically dumb, but most reasonable people know better. Black people especially, the ones experiencing this cruel racism, are not dumb. They know what's happening here. And perhaps that knowledge is both a blessing and a curse. A blessing because they can do something to uproot this inherently racist society, and a curse because they can recognize that so many peaceful methods haven't worked in the past, and despite everything, despite the progress that is talked about and shoved down their throats, they're still dying in the streets. From the government. So then, what are they to do when peace doesn't seem to be working? Well, people tend to fall back on what they know in times of confusion. And what many black Americans know is violence. Not because it's inherent to their genetics or anything, but because their society has failed them. Like the higher societies, and like in this example, the US itself. And poverty and crime are a cycle. Crime is majorly a result of poverty, and what crime serves to do is further impoverish those neighborhoods. This mirrors, like so many great things do, to the tragic arc of David Martinez. Now, I will warn you of spoilers ahead, as I will be providing an excerpt from my Cyberpunk Edgerunners analysis. To best analyze this, let's look at episode 6 and primarily at Maine. The opening scene of him running in the desert is probably a perfect representation of his hopelessness. He lives in a city that constantly talks about dreams, in a society that constantly pumps into his brain the endless possibilities that even someone like him can achieve. Something like brain dance isn't dissimilar to our social media, in that it makes us seek joy in the lives of others in a non-reality. This dichotomy then, as it always seems to do, makes us yearn for power in our personal lives, so that we may have the freedom to pursue the dreams that we want, the dreams that we see, the dreams that others are clearly achieving. Why not us then? If this really is the city of dreams, then why am I so unhappy? Of course, Maine is running through an empty desert with seemingly no end in sight. There are no answers here. As the radio broadcaster talks about traffic, about a difference between regular people and those others. Perhaps Maine, having seemingly been brought up impoverished, sees himself in the latter. Perhaps even he feels disgusted with himself for something that he has no control over. He wants that control. And as he stands before a line in the road, a distinct separation between the dirty, worn-down sand and a new side of pure, unsoiled sand, he thinks about dreams. He thinks about being on that other side and how he might be able to get there. And just then, he hears the lines that may be able to lead him there. Never fear the risk. You'll never make it big at dreaming quiet, dreaming small. And as I looked at Maine's face, drawn with such hyper-realistic detail and unique lighting effects, that I knew this was a big moment, I saw in him a decision. To become a Night City legend. To dream big. To try and cross that line. Quote over. Dreams. In my analysis of the first season of Arcane, I talked about dreams quite a bit. How Shimmer was able to infect the Undercity so easily because the oppressed people there wanted a taste of power. And I then mirrored that to the very real accounts of black Americans during the 1980s crack epidemic. In a society that has constantly told them they were nothing, they just wanted to be somebody. To finally cross that line in the desert. Violence is not usually the answer. Again, I'm not so deluded to believe and say that it never is the answer. I mean, look at the founding of this very country I live in. But what violence especially is an expression of power. I believe that the riots in America based around the Black Lives Matter were multifaceted. Yes, these people were confused, often young kids, born into a society that did very little to care for them. And yes, perhaps they knew no better course of action for change than to fall back on what their neighborhoods taught them. Of course, another failure of the wider society. But maybe the core reasoning here is that violence is that expression of power. I mean, we have those rooms where you break stuff for a reason. Destruction, I think, just feels cathartic, in that is an innate human fact. You feel like you're doing something, anything, to grasp at that power you see dangling over your head, to fight back. Because you've been taught from an extremely young age that self-esteem almost has a direct correlation to one's own ability to hurt people, to do violence right. And it makes sense. One's own status in crime-infested places is determined by similar standards. It's clear that Powder is heavily influenced by this. Even as early as episode 1, we see how her low self-esteem is caused by her inability to fight. And while I have no actual evidence to back up this claim, if I were to put myself in her head, I would do nothing but think, what if I were stronger? Could I have saved them? Power becomes value. Violence becomes the goal. It was the environment that Piltover created that fostered this, what Vi abandoned and Silco manipulated. And now I want you to replace Jinx with a child from the Middle East. Imagine the death of their loved ones, the environment that praises only violence and power, the loss, the hatred, the manipulation, taken under the wing of a greedy cult leader and told where to place that hatred, given an enemy, a target, some semblance of a reason to keep on living in this shitty world. Who would that person become? Again, this person here, character or real, is not justified. They are wrong. They do evil things, but they're also human. And in understanding that, perhaps a solution can be found. Or perhaps not, because we still can't forgive. Now, I want to harken that last point that I had made in my Season 1 analysis. Perhaps that person is justified. Perhaps they're not. Maybe violence is sometimes the only way to create change when one is initially met with oppression and violence. I'm honestly not sure. That's for you to answer. And yes, Jimmy, I know black-on-black violence is very high, and that black Americans proportionally are convicted of more crime. So they must be inherently bad, you say to yourself. And yet I hope I've done at least a half-decent job at giving you the very important sociological, and especially psychological, context behind that. And I do say convicted very intentionally, as perhaps our criminal justice system is just a bit on the racist side. Also, I'm just a white dude, so take everything I say here with a grain of salt. Okay? Now, this is the Jinx side of things, but what about Ekko? What answers has he found? Well, to build something. And again, I'm not in any position to say which method is best, but, well, they are certainly different. Sometimes, to save hell, you have to leave heaven. A running theme in the entirety of ARCANE, so much so that the last song of Season 1 is named after this concept, is what could have been. And in Episode 7, we see fully what could have been. We see Ekko happy, with the crush of his childhood, and things seem good. And what separates ARCANE from the rest of its contemporaries is that it is good here. There is no secret evilness lurking under the surface. No external reason for Ekko to have to leave. Honestly, he has every reason to stay. And yet, he doesn't. He leaves. He has to decide purely internally to leave this own personal heaven of his. To leave everything he ever wanted, the happy version of everything he had given up. He left what could have been. This feeling is perfectly encapsulated in Ekko and Powder's dance scene. It's literally everything he ever wanted. A thriving Undercity, his father figure alive, and the love of his life in his arms. And it's also not some simulation or some hive mind like Victor wants. This is an actual reality. And dear viewer, what is so vital to understanding here is that he could have just stayed. But he doesn't. He leaves heaven to rescue hell. Victor is sometimes referred to as literal Jesus by the end of Season 2, but that seems to be mostly for the memes. But Ekko, the boy's savior, he is what Jesus really embodies, leaving a perfect paradise to save a hellish reality. Because, well, hell simply needs saving. And Ekko wants to build his dream in his real home with his people amongst the rubble. Ekko's entire character is initially built to be the opposite of Jinx. He wants to build something special in the underground. But what episode 7 highlights to us directly through the text is that he isn't so different from Jinx. He came from the same Undercity, they have the same roots and similar trauma, and yet they do choose different paths. But perhaps Ekko's reasoning, while certainly being righteous, is not quite so pure. I just want to say thank you. You know, for everything. I used to dream the Undercity could be like this, but somewhere I got consumed by all the ways it wasn't. I gave up on it. Gave up on you.
I've never seen you give up on anything, Ekko.
Are you tearing up? Because you know damn well I am. Ekko creating his community in the Firelights was a righteous and noble mission. And yet, like I said, it wasn't entirely pure. In many ways, Z directly says here, he gave up on a thriving Undercity. And while he refused to not take in people even though he had reached capacity, his dreams no longer encompass the entirety of the underground. Just like Vander with the lanes, Ekko ultimately, even if unintentionally, left out people, and even directly opposed people he couldn't bring himself to agree with. And I'm not saying he should have agreed with Silco or Jinx, but I think his fundamental failing was in not seeing them as anything but inhuman monsters. Powder is Dead ignores the very real girl, Jinx, in pain. And again, it's natural and honestly great character writing that Ekko wouldn't include them in his eventual dream. But that initial dream of a truly thriving Undercity, he accepted people despite capacity issues, yet he couldn't bring himself to accept people that he saw as too far gone. In this way, he is undeniably human. But this is where comparisons to Victor and his glorious evolution really come into play. Victor wanted to create heaven by completely purging all the bitterness and unfortunate violence in the world. But Ekko learns throughout episode 7 that perhaps we have to partially accept human nature. That sometimes we will fight and even kill each other to create a true paradise. I say partially because I don't think Ekko is advocating or even okay with these things, as he shouldn't be. Rather, he wants to save these people. Not in some empty, mindless collective consciousness way. Rather, he wants to critically try and understand where it is these people are coming from. To unearth their psychological scars and start to enact healing instead of covering it all up with a band-aid. I won't pretend to have the answers for everything. I don't think Ekko would make that claim either. But I think heaven only starts with an attempt at understanding. And he is no longer willing to give up on dreams, and especially people he once sought to protect and cherish. And yeah, perhaps some people truly are too far gone. I'm looking at you, Jimmy, for mouthwashing. But we can't know that answer until we try. Until we try. This is why I don't think it's any coincidence that Ekko, the boy savior, is ultimately the one who stops Victor, as well as Jace, who shares a similar ethos. Again, Ekko could have stayed in his own perfect paradise, but that would be leaving behind his own people, and he just isn't willing, not even for a second, to do that. If Eureka 7 taught me anything, it is that we must heal the world with love. And I know that sounds cheesy, that it isn't that easy, but I'm not even saying it's possible. What I am saying, however, is that we can at least try to understand each other, to love each other, despite everything. As often as love destroys us, perhaps it is the only thing that can bring us back together. I'm honestly not sure. But, hey, we won't know unless we try, right? And, as always, thank you for watching.